Bigfoot. Endangered mystery. In the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest dwells the strange and beautiful creature known as Bigfoot, perhaps. Sadly, logging and human settlement today threaten what might possibly be his habitat, although if it's not, they don't. Bigfoot populations require vast amounts of land to remain elusive in. They typically dwell just behind rocks, but are also sometimes playful, bounding into thick fogs and out-of-focus areas. Remember, it's up to us. Bigfoot is a crucial part of the ecosystem if he exists. So let's all help keep Bigfoot possibly alive for future generations to enjoy unless he doesn't exist. The end!
This week, in a turn of events that surprises me as much as it does you, we're talking Bigfoot. Writer and researcher Joshua Cutchin returns to the show along with co-author Timothy Renner, who is himself an author and host of the excellent Strange Familiars podcast. They both join us today to talk about the first volume of their epic two-part study, Where the Footprints End. Enjoy. Josh and Tim, thank you very much for your time.
An absolute pleasure to be here. Yeah, Jinx. Absolute pleasure to be here. I'm glad that I finally got you to talk about Bigfoot on a podcast.
Right. So for people who are maybe newer listeners to the show, I made an offhand comment years ago, and it's still kind of half true in a way, that Americans find, like baseball, Americans find Bigfoot way more interesting than the rest of the world. And ever since then, Josh and I have been, and I have every intention of continuing this little game through the episode, but Josh and I are playing this game where I don't like I don't like Bigfoot, or I find it boring, and it's and like all personal or in jokes, it's gone on way too long, and we find it hilarious.
Well, you're right about so many things. You're allowed to be wrong about one or two things. It's okay.
Very cool. All right. So, well, it sort of begs the first question in that vein. Whatever possessed you to write this book, guys?
I think that's Tim's question, because he's the one who recruited me into all this mess. You know, as we were discussing just before we started, I was looking down the barrel of twins in the late 2018. So I'd sort of sworn off writing another book after Thieves in the Night. But then I was on vacation at the beach, and I get this email from Timothy Renner, whom I had talked to a little bit. And Tim said, "Hey, you want to write a weird Bigfoot book?" So the real inspiration was his.
Yeah, it's just the book that needs to be written now, and it needed to be written 20 years ago, really, but it was time for it. I'm building up disdain is the wrong word for the cryptozoologist a take on Bigfoot, but I struggle with it. I really, really struggle with the cryptozoologist view that there's a giant ape man that just naturally occurs in North America, a breeding population, and there's nothing strange about it, according to them. But there's so much strange about it that we got 2 volumes. We could have done 5 volumes if we wanted, probably. But we got 2 volumes, very thick, healthy volumes of strangeness out of the topic. So I'm kind of done with hearing that strangeness seldom ever happens around Bigfoot. It's that's simply not the case.
It is, how to say this, you forget that there are actually people out there who are nuts and bolts when it comes to UFOs, or like when you say it's a book that needs to be written or had to be written 20 years ago, it's very diligent, and this is just volume 1, and we'll talk about the 2 separate volumes and the logic behind it in a second, but I get what you mean. I get this should have been out a couple of decades ago. It should have been in the sort of conversation stream, because you do kind of forget that. I mean, I love the Futurama quote about it, the gentle Sasquatch or wood ape. People do seem to think that remains a credible analysis of a range of sort of like hairy humanoid phenomena around the world, and I it's weird, like, because we're in it in different ways. Not me, obviously, less so with Bigfoot, but you forget, and then you encounter them. You forget that people out there go, "Wait, you actually think we should be out there looking for poop and putting it in plastic bags?"
And the leaps of logic that a lot of flesh and blood hypothesis advocates will go through about talking about Bigfoot walking backwards. There's the title of the book comes from, Where the Footprints End, is not only a reference to us needing to go beyond a purely scientific measure of Bigfoot, but also a reference to these abruptly ending trackways that you find in a lot of Bigfoot cases, where you'll just have the trackway of these large footprints that just terminate in an empty field with no cover on the ground for meters and meters and meters and meters. But you'll find people who are advocates of Bigfoot being a flesh and blood creature, and they'll say, oh, they tiptoe backwards through their footprints. They, grab a branch and they swish out their footprints as they walk forward from that point on. And it really is a classic example of having a conclusion in your head and working backwards from that solution. And, I've said for a while that of all the disciplines that exist, parapsychology, ufology, all these different sort of supernatural branches of investigation, cryptozoology was and always will be the last one to embrace the implications of things like psi research, of consciousness studies and whatnot. And the reason that I agreed, with Tim on this is because I felt, and I make this comparison not because I think that this book, nor Tim or I, are comparable to Valet in any way, but like we kind of sort of wanted to do a passport to Magonia for Bigfoot. Looking at
it comes through structurally, like you can tell that it's supposed to be Valet shaped, and it's like giving Bigfoot the Valet treatment, which is, I think Tim was probably referring to, it should have been written 20 years ago. It may well have influenced or changed the gentle Sasquatch or wood ape approach had that happened. And
there's also like this kind of gross thing in Bigfootery, which I separate a little bit from cryptozoology, because there's some real respectful work being done in cryptozoology not to do with Bigfoot, things like looking for the thylacine and whatnot. But there is this tendency in Bigfoot to not only treat, Native American cultures as a monolith, they either believe it's a spirit or an animal, period. They, this monolithic they, but also, so not only not looking at individual tribes and their beliefs, which are not that clear cut at all, in hardly any case, but also looking at this as an international, as a global, as a human archetypal figure. And that's something that Tim really did bring to the table, was like, let's start looking at Bigfoot through the archetype of the medieval wild man. And I'll be damned if there's not plenty of stuff. It's a very rich vein to mine for things that you see in these Bigfoot cases as well.
Have either of you read The Discovery of France?
No, I have not.
Yeah, I've not. No.
Yeah, it's super interesting. But I remember in the intro, the whole point of the book is about the French discovering France, right? Like, because it's historically been so Paris-centric, and after the revolution, they actually had to send people down, like, to map the rest of the country that they just collapsed, right? And it's interesting that the medieval wildman stories survived into basically the 1890s, where the stories in the sort of Basque-adjacent region of like wild men harassing crops and sheep, and then scurrying back off into the mountains. And this is like and at the time, Paris had quite a large empire, so it's not like it's some backwoods Transylvanian country. It's sort of fin de siècle Paris, and it's still getting wild men encounters. And it's like reading through that section of the book about medieval wild men, it's like there's not even medieval. They continue into the 19th century, and it's a really good vein to tap to explore what's explored in this first volume, I think.
Well,
yeah,
sorry,
the European wild man thing, like where you have traditional European cultures, and I give an example with the Belsnickel in Pennsylvania. You have this kind of rich cultural heritage of the German Swiss and what's called the Pennsylvania Dutch. They're not Dutch, they're German Swiss heritage, but with the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, or so-called Pennsylvania Dutch culture, the Pennsylvania German culture, you have this very tight folklore that's passed, because the language survives, the folklore tends to survive with it, and it's passed down. And you have this survival of a European, very traditional European wild man in the form of the Belsnickel that made it into really the early 20th century, before it was kind of overtaken by Santa Claus, the sort of kinder, gentler wild man.
Yeah, that's the thing that a lot of people don't really think about unpacking is the fact that, Odin and the Wadwos and the Belschnickel and Santa Claus and satyrs and fauns and, sort of the Christianization, the Christianized adoption of song as satyrs and fauns as like this sort of archetypal cloven hoofed Satan. They're all sort of part of the same soup, this hairy other humanoid being that lives in the woods as an evolution of this wild man archetype. But that you don't see that discussed very often.
Yeah. Before, that's a very good point. And it weirdly triggered a memory that's going to be this question. Before we get to the book and the logic of the 2 volumes, do either of you have like a first memory of hearing about, again, the gentle Sasquatch or wood ape, like as kids or in a book or on a TV show? Do you remember it's kind of like pinging going, that's something that I'm interested in?
I absolutely remember seeing the Patterson-Gimlin film on In Search of, a television show in the 1970s. I would have been 6 or 7 probably when I saw it, and saw this film and became completely fascinated, borderline obsessed even as a child. I would read about, I think there was 1 or 2 Bigfoot books in the school library, and I would just take them out of the library constantly and just read them over and over again. So yeah, I very clearly remember, and it definitely started with the Patterson-Gimlin clip.
Was it In Search of, Tim? I don't think we've ever talked about this.
I'm pretty sure it was In Search of, yeah.
For me, I guess I kind of just grew up with it. I mean, like as I've told you before, Gordon, I grew up as sort of a monster kid, and it wasn't until years later that I found out that my father, in like the 70s or 80s, subscribed to the Bigfoot Field Research Organization newsletter.
I didn't know that. I never knew that.
Yeah, he told me that a while back, and I'm like, oh, so my dad was always like interested kind of in Bigfoot, but it's not like we had Bigfoot shoved down our throats or anything. But just being a monster kid, I generally just gravitated towards Bigfoot. And there was a time in my life where I was like, the Bigfoot was the only sort of supernatural thing besides maybe ghosts that I believed in, because I thought that the UFOs were too varied and their occupants too varied as well to possibly be an alien species. And that's before I became enlightened as to the other hypotheses. But yeah, I've been interested in Bigfoot for as long as I can remember, and I really can't put a pin in when that exactly happened.
Interesting. That's really cool. So it begs the no, almost. Let's talk about the logic of this book. It evolved from, as these kind of bigger projects do, or when you accidentally catch a whale. There's going to be 1 book, and now it's 2. So talk us through the actual publishing structure. What are we looking at with these 2 volumes?
How do we even come up with a list of what to talk about, Tim? I'm trying to think of how we compiled our. I mean, I always had sort of flirted with some of these topics in some of my other books. Like, I'm sort of like the Therefore Fairies guy. I've gotten that kind of a reputation because I've been so interested in fairy folklore. But so obviously, that was something that I've been paying attention to for a while. But some of these other topics, I don't really know how we sort of arrived at dividing it up. Tim, do you have any insight into that?
I have no recollection. In fact, when I go back and read this, we have our names on separate chapters, but obviously we're bouncing ideas back and forth. And some of these things, as I read through, I can't honestly remember. I mean, some I certainly remember. Okay, that that's my research or whatever. But some of them I just absolutely can't remember who did what. So as far as coming up with the topics, I think that was very early on. And I think because my original, before I brought you on, like I said, it would have been a different book if I had done it by myself. Mm-hmm. I'd still be working on it in 10 years, probably. I wouldn't have gotten it done. But I was going to just do kind of an encyclopedic approach and just, A is for Albatwitch, B is for whatever, G is for glowing eyes, however, and just kind of go through and list all these strange things in relation to Bigfoot. It would have been a very different project and a very different end result. So I think I had a lot of these topics in mind, and then it was just a matter of kind of picking out which was worth devoting a whole chapter to and what to nest under topics. We did a lot of nesting of, bulletproof Bigfoot fits under witches because this or whatever, So
I mean, so for me, like some of the stuff was pretty obvious. Like it's become more and more of something that Bigfooters are willing to talk about, this real strong correlation between areas of high Sasquatch activity and anomalous lights. So that's obviously something to talk about. The UFO Bigfoot connection has been talked about in, sort of paranormal circles ad nauseum, especially if you look at the work of Stan Gordon in the 1970s. Hairy ghosts was a term that I'd heard before, so looking at Bigfoot through that lens was natural. The Wildnisgeist concept that I mentioned about how a lot of Bigfoot activity seems to mirror poltergeist activity is also something that people touched upon. But like with my other books, people would like mention it in a paragraph or a throwaway sentence. They never really sink their teeth into it any deeper than that. So yeah, I think that's part of it. Part of it too is just sort of picking things here and there that sort of arose through the ether. Some of it was completely spontaneous, like the idea of viewing Bigfoot through the witch archetype. And of course, I know your audience pretty well. Like, please no one take offense by me saying, because in the book we have a whole chapter on the similarities between Bigfoot and typical witch archetypes, and I realize that there's a whole tradition of cunning men and cunning women and people who are beneficent practitioners of magic, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like the cultural negative association of witches. And there was a mention of a hairy witch in a documentary about Bigfoot, and I said to myself, well, that's interesting. Has anybody really looked into it? And there's some interesting parallels I never thought I would have actually found about Bigfoot and sleep paralysis, Bigfoot and so just hairy witches throughout a lot of European folklore, and also some Native American folk or some Native American tribes. Their folklore also describes some of these Bigfoot analogs as being witch-like or being ogresses with magical powers.
Yeah, I wouldn't apologize for that. That was my favorite bit.
Okay. Well, I'm writing this because I'm much more aware of like the magically operant community than I was 5 years ago when I was writing Trojan Feast.
Sure.
I'm like, are people going to be upset by this?
Yeah. Well, for me, one of my hills to die on is that the sort of 20th century academic idea that the witch is solely an archetype of like female empowerment or a kind of response to structural misogyny is just the whitest idea, because it's true, but it's narrowly true. Like the term or the understanding of what a witch is that it's much wider than that. It's negative in most places. It's extra dimensional, so the overlaps with cattle mutilations are there historically around the world. So you can't just say like a witch is like a powerful oppressed woman, because that's just the most middle class white thing ever. And what I liked about this is it's an additional thing. I went straight to things like UFOs and cattle mutilations and child abductions because they're easier. They're a more obvious collection of examples for widening out the witch beyond its sort of defanged purely Western political idea, which is in there, but it's just one thing of a lot of them, right? And this was really cool for me. Like I liked because obviously when you're talking about sleep paralysis, there's already a hag attack kind of overlap. But one of my favorite stories in the book is the Les Stroud encounter near Alberta. So I'll throw it to either of you. I don't know who wrote that one, but if you want to kind of give us an overview of that, that's a good example of what we're talking about, I think.
Yeah, that'd probably be me. So there's actually, as much as we talk about the old hag as being an archetype of sleep paralysis, there's no shortage of people who report large hairy entities in conjunction with sleep paralysis. And the definition of Bigfoot is pretty wide, so it's kind of easy to find these like man-like hair covered things that appear when people have sleep paralysis. There's one of my favorite stories is the story of a night watchman on Oak Island who ended up, drinking himself to death after having an experience where he woke up and there was this red-eyed creature crouching on top of his chest that told him to leave and never come back, and it was covered in hair from head to foot. But the instance that you're referring to was, Survivor Man Les Stroud, who's kind of become a bit of a Bigfoot advocate in the past couple of years, and certainly I would say he's starting to tend towards more the paranormal Bigfoot angle. He had an instance in Alberta. This is one of several instances. He actually had some mind speak happen to him that I think we cover in volume 2 rather. But he had an experience while overnighting in Alberta, Canada, on top of a mountain. a Bigfoot hotspot, and he claimed that he woke in the middle of the night and saw these gigantic lights, like you said, it would be the size of a shopping mall if it was actually an airplane, and they sort of hovered in the sky off to the side of the mountain for about 20 minutes, and then they vanished and he fell asleep, which is always something that I find interesting in these stories about people who are able to fall asleep after seeing the most miraculous thing ever. But later that same night, he said that he woke up and he felt something sitting on him, like these two giant buttocks on his chest. He didn't really get a feeling of dread, which runs counter to the idea that it might have been straight up sleep paralysis. He sort of felt like sort of an impish, sort of tricksterish kind of quality to it. But the next morning he woke up and he went to a bait tree that he had set up with some different things that would be enticing to a large hairy primate, perhaps some food and stuff. And he said, I'm just going to recite the quote here. He actually had a camera that was set up to record the bait tree, and he said, everything that was on the tree disappears before our eyes. 1 second it's there in the footage, it's there on the tree, and the next it's gone. He looked at the footage again. The only thing that he was able to see between those two instances was this like conical head that pops up from the bottom of the frame, and the bottom of the frame would have been about 7 feet tall. So it's strongly indicative that there was some sort of Bigfoot sleep paralysis UFO thing going on. And the center of that Venn diagram is where I really thrive as somebody who's interested in this stuff. The places where these things that shouldn't collide.
Did either of you have anything weird happen in the writing of the book, as can happen when?
Oh, Tim's got weird stuff happening all the time. He's the master of the synchro, but I'm paranormal kryptonite, so I'll put it over to Tim.
In terms of Bigfoot, there's a abandoned ghost town in Pennsylvania called Pandemonium. And I'll go ahead and straight up say I never saw Bigfoot, so this may fit in with the wilderness geist theory, the wilderness poltergeist. But that was, during the writing of this book, we decided to go there, and we had no clue. We were going there because it was a ghost town and there were ghost stories associated with it. We weren't going there for Bigfoot. And we camped out in this area, 6 miles from nowhere. And I was woken up at, I think it was either 3 or 3:30 in the morning by wood knocks right near my tent, less than 100 yards away for sure. Very loud. I had enough sense about me to hit record on a stereo recorder I had with me, and you can hear the wood knocks. You can hear them answer. You can see it in a different channel when you look at it in stereo. So something with hands was swinging something, I guess. I mean, I didn't see what made the knocks. We spent the night, it was a pretty fearful night from that point on. We got up and could hear something walking around the camp. And I was with a very, very experienced woodsman who was not easily shaken. And to his credit, he kept me together. I would have, if I was alone, I probably would have left that night. But something walked around the camp. And then, most interestingly, in the morning, we were breaking camp down, and I had my pack hanging up from paracord that I tied around a tree. And I had not gone around the backside of this tree to check. So I'm untying it, and I swing the paracord around and wound into the paracord. If you can imagine a spring, how you could wind it into the cord, and something with hands would have had to do that. Wound into the paracord was a rusty spring, like a bed spring. And we went around the back of the tree to look at, after I just was completely stunned as this thing comes around. And then I'm looking from the back of this tree, and you can actually see this kind of wake through the ferns. Something big had come through the ferns that actually stepped over a old rusty bed spring. That was, again, this was a ghost town, so this was some kind of old rusty bed spring that was just tossed in the woods there, and presumably picked up one of the springs and wound it into the paracord, which is, I was completely stunned. And there's some other really, really weird kind of stuff that goes along with this. I have a friend who is doing gifting with something in the woods that, he thinks possibly Sasquatch in the Pacific Northwest. I'm on the East Coast of America. I'm in Pennsylvania. And we had some very, very strange synchros with things that he left me, he gave me to leave here. and things I gave him to leave there. And we started getting very, very synchronistic responses on things that were left for both of us. It's a very long story, very hard to describe in any kind of linear fashion, but very, very interesting to me.
Yeah, I want to come back to the gifts in a minute, but it suddenly occurs to me, particularly in Josh's case, because we've spoken before. I haven't spoken to you since the event I did with Austin in Portland at As Above, have I?
Right. Yeah, you alluded to that in one of our conversations, but
yeah. So an attendee at we were all drinking afterwards, but an attendee in the drinks afterwards came and said, "Oh, let me show you my Bigfoot picture on his phone," and he showed me and Greg Carwood, and it is the best fucking Bigfoot picture I have ever seen. And the woodknock thing reminded me of it, because it was sort of not necessarily by the side of the road, but like within running distance of the car, and it was kind of very loud woodknocking coming from over the hill. And so we walked up the hill, and there's this shot on the phone, and it's like a trans-dimensional giant sort of phasing in and out of reality, gentle Sasquatch, like hitting a tree with a log, not just like a stick, but just like a crash. Most amazing image, and I'm like, wow, that's that's kind of cool. And it's sort of the full thesis, right? Because it doesn't look quite there. And really, really, really interesting stuff. But that was kind of fun.
The picture that you saw, it actually looked like it was swinging something into the tree.
It had a log hitting a tree.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
I want to see. You can't, like, you're such a tease, man. I want to see this. Like,
it's not mine to give or share.
I know it's not. But now it's going to turn into like the equivalent of that damn Thunderbird photo that everybody's rattling on about.
True. All right, cool. So let's go back to the gifting, because I thought this is interesting for a bunch of reasons. It supports the wider thesis, at least in, I mean, not that you're going to change your thesis in volume 2, but like volume 1 is specifically, the subtitle is folklore, right? So there's a lot of that kind of like global overview stuff in it. But there's, let's talk a bit about gifting and the role of gifts in these encounters, and sort of include the kind of like Blair Witch style arrangement of sticks and other detritus, because I think that's the same thing. It's like, it's object-based communication, I suppose.
Oh yeah. And we go into the volume I have on, or the chapter I have on stick signs, as people call them, or stick structures, I do a whole chapter of that in volume 2, and actually call the chapter hex signs, because to me, the idea that some people in the Bigfoot world think these are trail markers, maybe, or hunting blinds, or some kind of structures to sleep in. They're piss poor structures to sleep in. They're always open to the sky. They're very poor hunting blinds. There's not enough there to hide, a person, much less a giant ape man. So there's some other thing with these, and I have wondered if they are not some sort of possible 3-dimensional sigil that these creatures are making, if they're magically inclined. So that's all in volume 2, but that's a tease. I thought your audience might like that approach to the Bigfoot phenomenon. But in any case, the gifting is consistent with just spirit gifting that cultures have done throughout time. And I think it's very naive of people to not see that. Your sort of flesh and blood Bigfoot people, one of my favorite examples is the Bigfoot garden that people say to make. They'll say, to keep Bigfoot out of your garden, you want to make a separate garden for Bigfoot, like closer to the woods. And the Bigfoot will know somehow, how they know, I don't know. They will know that this extra garden is for them, and they won't touch your garden then. Well, this is not unlike, it is unlike any other animal, which would now just say, oh, great, I'm a caloric opportunist. Now I have 2 places from which to pilfer food. But somehow Bigfoot knows. And I point out in the book that this is a dedicated space. You're creating a dedicated space with intention. So you've got intention behind it for Bigfoot. So you are essentially, whether you like it or not, you're doing spirit offering at this point. And much of this gifting falls into that, which people have done so, cultures have done so back as far as we know.
Yeah, I find that stuff kind of interesting because from an anthropological perspective, one of the sort of 150-year running questions is essentially how Northwest Europe came up with capitalism and what other people do. And so, like, gift economies has been rightly and wrongly and competently and incompetently an area of examination for a century, right? And Dame Marilyn Strachan in the 80s did the best stuff around it in Melanesia. And I think about this sort of spirit gifting as no different from more intelligent cultures than ours kind of just being situated in place. So a go-to example I use all the time is Aboriginal Australia will do things like create watering holes for kangaroos, even if they're not necessarily hunting them, but it's about that kind of participation in everyone flourishing, and the same kind of thing of offering or making habitat and vice versa. There's this exchange process that goes on when you don't have notions of like money and industrial civilization and whatever. And it just seems that, and consequently, it's almost like spirit gifting is no different. And it wouldn't be in like an animist culture, it wouldn't be different that you're in that kind of interactivity, exchange, communication approach, and particularly when it comes to stuff that, like a Bigfoot, a gentle Sasquatch will leave outside your tent or teepee. That carries some status with it, because that came from something that wasn't just like a bird, right? It actually came from something else. And when you have a high status gift, they kind of, at least in Melanesia, like the kind of idea was initially that you would get status for giving a gift, and you would only retain it so that you could get the status for giving it onto someone else. And it just feels like the only kind of macro logic that I can see in the living in a big footy area and waking up and having like an arrangement of stones on your back patio and then responding with stones and then getting a different arrangement back and so on. That seems like a kind of thing that you find in gift-based cultures, and it just seems like it has that spirit logic behind it that eludes us because we come out of a very different mode of understanding what exchanges are.
Well, so if I could sort of chime in with something, I mean, a lot of the behavior that people will ascribe to Bigfoot, especially when they like allege that Sasquatch is around but don't actually see it, really does sort of line up with the criteria that you would expect from interacting with spirit. I mean, they respond to invocations, vocalizations and wood knocks. They tend to, sort of inhabit areas. They're not walking around in the middle of the city, right? They're less human traffic. They show their presence often through environmental effects like, knocks and moving things. And there's this sensation that a lot of Bigfooters will tell you, even the flesh and blood guys, that you feel them just as much as you see them. Like, oh, I know that they're in this area right now. Something that really blew my mind was a good friend of mine, and who was just, a brilliant guy named David Metcalf. I was with him at this museum in North Georgia called Expedition Bigfoot. Now, before you laugh, I talk about this in the book a little bit about how the owner of Expedition Bigfoot set up this Bigfoot museum, which is actually very well done, very, very, somber, not somber, but very, very serious about the subject. And, they know their stuff. That's a lot of foot casts and hair samples and dropping samples, which is something to be seen. But he erected this museum to Bigfoot in North Georgia, which has, a lot of Bigfoot activity typically associated with that area. And he's like, it's funny, ever since I put this up, we just been getting more and more reports on an exponential basis. And my friend David Metcalf said, well, yeah, you basically put a shrine to Bigfoot up. You put a temple to Bigfoot up, and it's a place where, believers gather, where non-believers are converted, where you get together and you look at these, it houses sacred relics to Bigfoot, all these different, casts and different samples of different things. It's like you create a temple to Bigfoot. So of course the phenomena is going to sort of accrue around this area because you're paying him homage,
Do you want Bigfoots? This is how you get Bigfoots.
Basically.
One of the ones that I thought was kind of interesting, speaking of the sort of strange effect. Actually, let's do it in a more methodical fashion. We've spoken about, and it's very true. Like even the diehard cryptos will be aware of a quote unquote UFO connection to it. But what are some of the other high strange overlaps? So we've got the UFO one. We've got. Have we spoken enough about like ghosts? I think we should do that. Like we sort of briefly spoke about the dead, but that one and like the Jim and Jack ghost box story, I think is my favorite in the book.
Yeah, with the Ovilus. So I think we sort of have to. I put them into separate categories because I think that if you look at the Psi research, they definitely are differently categorized. Poltergeists versus ghosts, so I talk a little bit about how there are plenty of reports that you can find on Bigfoot researchers' pages that talk about Bigfoot accounts where Bigfoot isn't seen, but there are Bigfooty kind of things happening, voices in the forest and strange smells and rocks being thrown at you and knocks in the forest. And in my first chapter, Tim has the first chapter, I have the second chapter, I sort of unpack how if this activity happened in a house, you would say poltergeist, because these are accounts where Bigfoot is never seen, but because you're in the forest, you automatically say Bigfoot. So really trying to get people to question their conceptions about, or rather question their assumptions about what lies behind a lot of these odd phenomena. And, honestly, if you read the whole book and you try to think that it has some sort of grand central thesis at the end of it, you're going to be really confused because the chapters are all over the place. Fairies, witches, poltergeists, ghosts, aliens, all these different things. We're just saying that these are different lenses through which to view the same phenomena. But there is a very strong tradition in a lot of cultures of this concept of the hairy ghost that would sometimes cause sleep paralysis, would sometimes terrorize people. A lot of these things that people have reinterpreted as Bigfoot encounters today appear in these newspapers, especially, pre, I would say 1930 accounts that talk about these hairy ghosts. They say a hairy ghost was seen, and it clawed at young ladies' dresses, and it terrorized the community. And you'll find that, and within that, you'll also find things that we would normally associate with ghosts. So Tim alluded earlier to the fact that we sort of had to nest things. So there isn't necessarily a dedicated chapter on invisible Bigfoot or Bigfoot phasing through things or Bigfoot disappearing. None of this has its own dedicated chapter because we instead decided to nest it within, in this case, in this volume, certain folklore. So for me, like what passes through things, what goes invisible, what's bulletproof, ghosts are all those things. So each within that ghost chapter, these different topics get these different subheadings. So, we talk about cases where people will see a Bigfoot and they'll say that it will disappear, and they'll be very clear. They'll even say in the account, it didn't dive behind a tree. It didn't, jump into the bush. It didn't run away. It literally winked out of existence. Sometimes you'll find people who say, I saw a Bigfoot and it not only did it levitate off the ground, but it passed through a fence without opening the gate. And then this really persistent thing, which is, I think in a lot of ways, from a certain perspective, the most damning thing about, from the standpoint of flesh and blood cryptozoologists, is that you can't kill Bigfoot. People say that they kill Bigfoot and the body always disappears, or you have this mysterious, shady government organization that comes along, or the person conveniently forgets where the body was. But you can't kill Bigfoot. I mean, so many times people say that they shoot Bigfoot and they don't even flinch, and I sort of try to unpack, the intersection of large mammals and firearms and how those things intersect, and how, regardless of the animal, it should react in some manner. But these are sort of the high strange things that people often cite. I mean, there's one example from somewhere out west in the U.S. The exact place escapes me right now, but a police officer with several other officers basically corralled this Bigfoot in between their squad cars, and the thing just blinks out of existence, and they can hear it running off through the woods, but they can't see where it is. And these are the things that again, the examples that, or the solutions that cryptozoologists will offer for these anomalies are kind of silly. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the concept of infrasound, the idea that these these entities can, or these, not these entities in their case, these apes can somehow produce much akin to a tiger, these subsonic frequencies. And these frequencies are so disorienting that you just like sort of lose your mind for a moment, and that's their chance to escape. And what you're doing is you're not saying that it disappeared. You're saying that, it escaped, and you sort of lost your sense of, of awareness during that moment, which, is kind of patently silly because people in these cases aren't expressing any other sort of physiological effects. The example that you referred to, to finally come around to your initial question, was a father and son who were kind of into the whole Bigfoot thing. They were from Michigan, and they had decided to go on a road trip to Tombstone, Arizona, the site of the famous OK Corral shootout. And before they left, they met with a psychic, because obviously these are, weirdos like us. And the psychic told them that, just so you know, there'll be a Bigfoot following you on your trip. They're like, okay, whatever that means, because we're going from Michigan to Tombstone. That's kind of out of the question. But they went to the Birdcage Theater, which is a historic site in Tombstone, also purportedly a very haunted site. And they had a sort of a private tour with some ghost hunters who allowed them to use this device called an ovilus, which it's kind of like a ghost box. I think it's probably the simplest way to describe it without wading too far into the weeds. But they had this ovilus between them. They were asking different questions. They were getting certain voices back of different tenors. And their host, who was aware of the fact that this father and son were really interested in Sasquatch, said, have any of the spirits here ever seen a Bigfoot? And there was a spirit that said yes. And not only that, yes, but there was actually a Bigfoot in the building with them. And of course, the fact that the psychic told them that a Bigfoot would follow them, they were kind of weirded out. Apparently the spirit said that they were big, tall, and hairy, and that the spirits in the birdcage were scared of the Bigfoot, and they were scared of the fact that they had, this father and son had brought the Bigfoot to them. So they politely asked, and I don't know how you do this with a straight face, but they politely asked the Bigfoot to leave. And this apparently it did, because the spirits responded that it was, everything was hunky-dory now. But on their way from this session in the birdcage, they went back to their car, and right behind their car was a giant piece of rebar shoved through this giant pole, and the two of them had to actually move it. And it obviously wasn't there prior to their arriving, because it would have impeded them actually pulling into their parking space. So they get home, and the father sits down while his son prepares for bed, and he sees basically through their camper window, a Bigfoot. And he says, hey, what are you doing? Can you leave, or whatever? And, he's kind of halfway wondering, I'm sure, in the story, whether or not he actually saw what he saw. But the next day, his son wakes up, and, he asks him how he slept. And he was like, I didn't really sleep well because I was thinking about everything. And it's like, yeah, it was pretty crazy, at the birdcage. And the son says, no, I'm pretty sure that when I got back, I saw a Bigfoot looking through the window. So it's one of those stories that, I'm sure that if you presented this to an old guard cryptozoologist, they'd find a way to say that, not only was the spirit box communication complete coincidence, which I would be more sympathetic to, but that they just happened to see a Bigfoot there outside Tombstone. But it's a really strange, really strange conglomeration of events that point to the fact that these things are in fact related on some sort of level.
Yeah, and related to awareness, like speak of the devil and he shall appear kind of stuff. Because if you kind of front load these guys with you're going to be followed by a Bigfoot, then whatever's going on with the ghost boxes and whatever happens when you're in an anxious and intense situation like a haunted theater or whatever, you kind of, again, do you want Bigfoots? This is how you get Bigfoots. And that is that's crucial, I think, to understanding the value of looking at this kind of material, because you don't find the gentle Sasquatch. You find a really weird universe that you live in.
Yeah, at the same time, I think that, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us, that intention is really important. They weren't trying to bag a Bigfoot. They were just, they were interested in Bigfoot, and they had, they're sort of, if Bigfoot showed up, I'm sure they would have been ecstatic, and if it didn't, they wouldn't have cared. So that sort of is in contrast to a lot of these people who are like, let's form a posse of 20 people and go find Bigfoot because we're gonna catch ourselves a Bigfoot, I think that speaks to that nature, that sort of reactive nature of the phenomena as well.
Yeah, definitely. Let's just thinking about it. Let's go in the opposite direction, because as with quote unquote UFOs, there are a couple of cases or collections of evidence that might be actual aliens out of a vast discourse where it extremely likely isn't. What are to your knowledge, you guys, what best evidence do we have for it being like an actual undiscovered North American hominin somewhere? Like, what are the one or two that you go, do you know what? Like, it doesn't mean that this is in fact what's going on, but like, that's actually pretty good evidence that something quite physical and remaining physical was there for a while.
I'm going to lead with this, and I'm going to hand it off to Tim, because I mean, we both spoke at Fort Fest this past year, and we had somebody come up to me afterwards and say, well, what do you make of footprints? What do you make of, feces and hair and et cetera? And I said, number one, there's this false dichotomy between the physical and the non-physical, and there's also a false dichotomy between the imaginal and the imaginary. But if I wanted to really sort of dumb this down and simplify it, ghosts, I think we can all agree, just whatever your definition of what they are might be, are non-physical but leave physical effects. They slam doors, they leave footprints, they leave handprints, they move things. There's obviously the non-physical can act on the physical world. I mean, this is a body of evidence that psi phenomena has been telling us for decades. But also in terms of like the sort of physical evidence left behind, I mean, you have seances where ectoplasm is left behind. You have UFO sightings where angel hair is left behind. The idea that, and to say nothing of burn marks and actual, physical effects on witnesses. In terms of like the strongest evidence for it, the first thing when somebody says that they're interested in Bigfoot, first thing the people, when they say that, the first thing I do is I press a copy of Jeff Meldrum's Bigfoot Legend Meets Science in their hands, because that book is an amazing, just basically more or less an analysis of footprints, talking about dermal ridges. We're talking about things that are specific to primate anatomy, like the mid-tarsal break, the idea that there's a point in the center of the foot that actually flexes different than in human feet. Just some really interesting stuff that only a doctorate in kinesiology would be able to draw these conclusions. And so that's sort of your gateway drug. And then I'm like, okay, now let's get weird. But for me, it's, I mean, again, that's why it's called Where the Footprints End. The footprints are and always have been the best evidence for Bigfoot being a physical flesh and blood creature. But what happens when we go beyond where the footprints end? I'm sure, Tim, I've been rattling on for long enough. Do you have something to say?
Well, the five-toed footprints are very compelling. But even within footprints, we have the problem of three-toed footprints and four-toed footprints, and all these, even cloven hoof footprints. Is that in the first volume or the second, Josh?
It is the Traverse Spine Gorilla of Labrador. That's basically a Bigfoot by all accounts, but the footprints it would leave behind were described as being akin to a giant ox.
Yeah. So, yes, the five-toed footprints are very, very compelling evidence. And when you hear someone like Jeff Meldrum speak on them, and he talks about things like, mid-tarsal break and dermal ridges, and even when he looks at, like, say, the Cripplefoot tracks and describes the whatever what's wrong with that is consistent with other foot injuries or foot biology, whatever it was.
Quick interjection: the Cripplefoot tracks, for anybody who doesn't know, they were a series of tracks found outside Bossburg, Oregon, that displayed what appears by all sense to be an injury or a deformity that some podiatrists have looked at and said, like, how could you possibly fake this? It's so consistent with an actual physical deformity that somebody might have after suffering an injury. Sorry, I just want to interject that.
Right. So these remain, the best evidence, and I don't blame someone like Jeff Meldrum, that's his world, for looking at those and saying, well, yeah, this must be a real creature because these are real tracks. And I mean, I would agree on both accounts. I think it is a real creature. I think they are real tracks, but I just don't think it is a natural ape, or
You don't think it's to use Futurama again, wandering into in and out of focus areas in the Pacific Northwest?
That's actually pretty prescient because I don't think Tim or I have written off the possibility that we're dealing with a physical creature that is somehow able to tap into some sort of external reality or some sort of, I hate to say interdimensional because how many angels can dance on the head of your pin, but like, some sort of possibly a magically operant hominid. Like I'm not, or a fluently magically operant hominid. I don't think Tim or I are really even putting that off the table.
Well, I don't see how you could, like, if and it doesn't. It's sort of like actual UFOs and what we can learn from the UFO phenomenon. The UFO phenomenon teaches us we live in a magical universe that on other planets will clearly include other organisms currently in physical bodies. Like it's not that big of a fucking deal, right? And it's sort of the same when you look at the Bigfoot phenomenon. It can lead you into a strange world of consciousness effects and all the rest of it. But because of that, by virtue of that, why there's nothing that violates that model by saying, well, actually, this creature might live in a dimension near here and have some capacity to wander in and out of them. Like that might be a thing it does, or it might not even be doing it deliberately. This is the stuff that people, which I know Josh and you and I have spoken about, the stuff that people miss in ballet is like, no, it's a physical phenomenon. It's a physical phenomenon. It's just not space aliens. Like a lot of this stuff is actually physical. Like we have physical effects. So that
or that it's defining its physicality based upon your expectations.
Correct. And there's clearly some of that's going on. But like this is what I mean by what's the stuff that the old timey cryptozoologists have that is like. And it's really good footprint stuff. They go, yes, in one instance. So if it's almost like Bigfoot is an opportunity to move into a magical universe if you approach it with the right frame. But in that magical universe, there might actually be these organisms with feet shaped like that will move in and out of our dimension for, as you say, one of less annoying terms.
If we take it in terms of, say, like saints' relics, that's how I like to compare it. So the footprints are the best we have, and they amount to secondary relics. The primary relics we have that people claim are real things, either the scat or the hair, these are very controversial, and so far nothing conclusive has come from any of them. The DNA studies, the one said that nothing but bears were found. I think the Sykes DNA study. The other DNA study by who was it, Josh? I'm drawing a blank on her name.
Oh, is it Melba freaking Ketchum?
Yeah. Hers is just not accepted by anyone. It's just considered junk science, but she has her supporters. There are people on both sides of the argument, expert and layman. But the primary relics we have, they either always go missing. I mean, lots and lots of people have said they've shot or killed or otherwise captured a Bigfoot or a Yeti over the years, and 100% of these bodies are gone by whatever process. Like Josh said, is it a black helicopter that comes and scoops them up, or some people say the other Bigfoot come out of the woods and grab their dead and go bury them. It doesn't matter. The end result is we don't have any bodies. There is no bodies that we can lay our hands on and study or anything. And the hair samples tend to go missing when people send them to hair experts. They very often go missing. There's a problem with them. And then you can get experts to line up on both sides that say they are or they aren't something special. So primary relics, what we have, no one can agree on.
The relic example is really good, especially, and this kind of comes back to some of Josh's earlier books as well, or just UFO lore in particular. But so the Shroud of Turin gets tested. It is not from Palestine 2,000 years ago, right? And you go, fine. What about all the effects it causes, right? So, and it's kind of like the being given flavorless pancakes by a UFO and then having that tested and go, there's nothing out of the ordinary that I can find in this test. I'm like, no, but somebody came out of a flying saucer and gave it to me. And so it's it's another place the footprints end. Kind of, is like, okay, test all you want. You're testing for something that can't show up on tests, right? And even if it is like, of course, it's going to be arranged of physical matter. It's a physical object, but what else it does? And the relic thing is a good example. You don't find too many instances of the true cross for a bunch of reasons, and yet these relics for 1,500 years have crazy effects surrounding them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's been, people have at least attributed healing to that kind of stuff. They touched the true cross, which was proven later to be, a splinter of something else, whatever. But they had a real effect from it.
I would also say that, as long as we're talking about like the interplay between the sort of the group of people who are interested in this and the actual phenomena itself, Tim pointed out something to me that really blew my mind. Obviously the UFO archetype has evolved from, dragons to air balloons from Magonia to steampunk airships to flying saucers to giant black triangles. But Tim pointed out something that really blew my mind. It's sort of, there's almost an inverse in terms of the wild man archetype. If you want to you say that more elegantly than I ever do, Tim. We talk about this a little bit in volume 2, but we're just going to go ahead and sort of dump that now, if that's okay. Tim, you want to sort of?
Well, yeah. So the medieval wild man is essentially a wizard. It has knowledge and wisdom.
Merlin, yeah.
Yeah, it's a magical being, wild from the wild, and over time it kind of changes. And I did a lot of work in my other books where I dug up these old newspaper articles which talk about what I believe to be, people seeing the 1800s equivalent of Bigfoot. I'm working on doing the whole country, but I've done Pennsylvania and the West Coast so far, and often they will talk about these big hairy things that obviously aren't people, but they'll be wearing, ripped up clothes, or sometimes they'll be carrying a rusty musket that won't actually fire. And back when I was, and I'll go ahead and say I started out fairly certain when I became interested in the Bigfoot phenomenon that it was a natural creature, and just over time and over my own experiences sort of went, no, this can't be.
But we all do. I mean, that's the same UFO story, right? I mean, like, we all think it's, it's aliens.
Yeah. I think that's the logical place to start, really. At least in some ways, but in any case, my take on it when I was originally finding these stories was it was Victorian culture sort of throwing clothes on these wild men, because they just couldn't even bear to print a story about a naked wild man running around in the woods. But over time, I started to think about it, and I started to look at the way the UFO has changed over time. And I thought, well, maybe the actual wild man is changing over time, and we have this, semi-human, back in the 1800s, where we're still kind of connected with nature. We still live by the seasons at this point, and this wild man is this in between for us. And as we've gotten further and further away from nature, and isolated from it, our wild man archetype has gotten wilder. And to the point where, nowadays we have the very, very wild Bigfoot.
Yeah, a changing conception of nature. Because what's always struck me about the old guard cryptozoology, right, is that it's very colonial literature. It's all very like Dr. Livingstone, I presume. It's kind of like white people expanding beyond the map into what we would have, like in the 19th century, the great unknown. It's not the great unknown. You're just invading. Like the people who live there, it's not
pretty damn well, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. You're not like no one discovers Africa, right?
Right.
And cryptozoology has that. Cryptozoology has the whole like Makolo Mbembe in the Congo and whatever. It's this kind of like this white fantasy of invasion, right? And so
very
and that, if you look at that's a 19th century understanding of country, because it's a place for us to move into and claim. So, and now country is not necessarily, it's a weird way of saying it, to protect it, but we have what is more urgent in our consciousness is the diminishing wildness So you get wilder wild men when you find it, but otherwise 19th century you're looking for like lost Israeli tribes and so on as you move across Turtle Island. And I think you're right there. I think as you encounter whatever these phenomena can be categorized as, if and when they can, that must inevitably change over time, because the land we move through changes over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree.
Yeah, that's all Tim. I wasn't that smart.
Very cool. So are they both out? I've only read volume 1, of course, but we're at the end of the show, so you might as well tell people where they can grab the book and when the next one's coming out and all that kind of stuff.
So to give people an idea of what volume 1 encompasses, the folklore parameters are pretty arbitrary. There's plenty of they've been divided into volume 1 folklore, volume 2 evidence, and there's plenty of evidence in volume 1 and plenty of folklore in volume 2. But this is just sort of a rough way for us to sort of try to wrestle our arms around this 200,000 word monster that we've created. So the chapters in volume 1 are The Company They Keep, which was penned by Timothy, talking about basically more or less window areas or areas of high strangeness. The Wildnisgeist chapter, which is me, which is looking at possible idea of a wilderness poltergeist as opposed to actually Bigfoot. Bigfoot and fairies, Bigfoot and aliens, for lack of a better term. Bigfoot and gifting, which is what we alluded to. Bigfoot and witches, Bigfoot and ghosts, and then Bigfoot and women in white. Tim, we didn't talk about women in white. It's the first interview we haven't talked about women in white. But the women in white chapter is sort of like the tour de force. It's the chapter where I said, Tim, you're barking up the wrong tree, and he just completely blew my mind with these connections. The archetype of the women in white and the archetype of the wild man. It's like the best chapter in the book. Volume 2 currently is divided into, I think as of yesterday, because we sort of updated some of our chapters, mystery lights, UFOs, which we sort of pulled apart from extraterrestrials, because the extraterrestrial/aliens chapter in volume 1 is more about the contact experience. The UFOs chapter is more about Bigfoot seen outside of UFOs. So Bigfoot inside UFOs versus Bigfoot outside of UFOs. Volume 2 will also include a chapter on vocalizations and mimicry, a chapter on altered states, which includes shape-shifting, mind speak, those sort of things. Hex signs, which we had talked about earlier. Anomalous numbers of toes, which excuse me, which go all the way up from 1 toe to literally 11 toes on 1 foot. Disappearing trackways and other anomalies associated with trackways. There are Bigfoot trackways that are all of a left foot or all of a right foot. The disappearing evidence chapter, which is something that Tim alluded to as well. A chapter dedicated to viewing Bigfoot through the George P. Hansen trickster lens, which I found really interesting because, the first time I picked up Trickster in the Paranormal, it was kind of devoid of Bigfoot. He pays a little bit of lip service here and there to Bigfoot as being part of this trickster thing, but he doesn't really dig into some examples. So I find some examples of how the trickster archetype manifests itself through different hoaxes and whatnot in the Bigfoot milieu, and then 2 case studies, which I'm kind of keeping the lid on those, but 2 case studies of 2 individuals who have had some insane Bigfoot encounters that really sort of throw everything involved in both volumes on top of each other.
Yeah, very cool. All right, and where do we find them? What's going on?
So you can find it on, that giant thing that's taking over the earth during the pandemic, Amazon.com.
Yes,
but I encourage
corner store. Carry on.
Yeah, right. But I encourage anyone, if you can, to support your local bookstore and request that possibly they order it. My website is joshuacutchin.com. You can find links to all 3 of my books, all 3 of my prior books, A Trojan Feast, The Brimstone Deceit, and Thieves in the Night. They're at joshuacutchin.com. And Tim.
You can find me at strangefamiliars.com. All the contact information there goes to me. I will have copies of the book. If you want to get one signed by both of us, it's going to be rough because Josh is in Georgia and I'm in Pennsylvania. So you're going to have to do some mail order kung fu or something to have that done, unless you find us in the same place, which does happen. It does happen rarely, but in any case, I'll have copies you can get direct sometime soon at some point, whenever the printer gets them to me. Otherwise, they're on Amazon, along with my other 4 books. You can look up either Timothy Renner, or if you type in Where the Footprints End, you should get a little link you can click on, either me or Josh.
And ditto on the direct copies as well, signed. They're sort of out of mind because I still have yet to hold this book in my hands, so I don't know if that's an option. But yeah.
Yeah, very cool. All right. Well, of course, this information is going to be all in the show notes. Congratulations. I think I hate to say it because I hate saying this, but you may have slightly changed my mind, Joshua. There's definitely. I get what I get. We sort of mentioned at the beginning, like there's a valet structure to the logic, at least of the first volume, and presumably the second. I think it's a book that the information and experiences that are amassed and put in a way that are going to be subsequently useful is something for which you should both be congratulated for, and thanked. Like it's good work that you guys did. So
thank you so much. Thank you.
That's very kind of you. I say, steepling my fingers and cackling that I got you to talk about Bigfoot.
Well, that's all we have time for. That actually is all we have time for. But like, no, thanks again, guys. It was honestly a great read and a really cool conversation. And yeah, we'll do this again.
Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you.
So I was chatting with Tim and Josh after the show, as you do, and we touched on something that is probably valuable to leave you with, particularly if maybe you are a new listener to the show. When I said their book had a valet shape or valet logic to it, I'll flesh that out a bit. So obviously, it's a reference to one of mine and many of your intellectual heroes, Jacques Vallée, whose pioneering work on UFOs has yet to be equaled, frankly, and it's like in its fourth or fifth decade. But what made his work so important is or was his phenomenological approach to UFO encounters. So the encounter itself and the subsequent descriptions were things themselves that can be analyzed, particularly in comparison to each other and across culture and that sort of thing. One didn't need to immediately drill down into seemingly scientific approaches like testing background radiation at supposed encounter sites and so on. There is a method of analysis that's in the not just the lived experience but the explanations of it, right? So what that approach did was open up shapes and similarities across time and culture in the range of experiences we categorize under the heading of UFO. So psi effects and missing time and all these sort of recurring motifs. It put the experiences in dialogue with existing human experiences and cultural motifs. And that proved to be a far more profound or enriching and insightful approach. And in dialogue is the right word for it, I think. Words. That's what Josh and Tim are accomplishing with their book. It's putting the range of phenomena umbrellaed under Bigfoot in dialogue with parapsychology and mythology and witch lore and spirit encounters and so on. So it's a fascinating catalogue of just how strange your cosmos can actually get when it wants to, on the one level. And it's a good read for that. But it will hopefully also assist in sort of further comparative efforts across the various high strange disciplines. So if that sort of thing is your jam, then definitely check it out. Details as ever in the show notes. Until next time.